So welcome to another Team CGC 9.8 video, and today I wanted to talk about some of the reasons why I really love CGC 9.8 books and why I chose to kind of focus on investing in CGC 9.8 books, because it wasn't just an accident. I did read a couple things and did some research, and there are a few reasons that compelled me to kind of stick with CGC 9.8 books. And I do have three reasons here of why, over time I've chose to stick to CGC 9.8 books, and I brought out my Star Wars number 76, which was the first CGC 9.8 book I bought. And, pretty much from this book, all I was looking for was just a Star Wars book with Darth Vader on the cover at that time. And I was really excited to kind of get a CGC 9.8 in the new case to kind of just see how they felt and what they looked like and stuff. So this was the actual first CGC 9.8 comic I bought. So before I get into the three reasons why I chose to focus on CGC 9.8 books, I just want to talk about, sort of what the title kind of insinuates is CGC 9.6 guy dead? And, personally, I don't think, if you're someone who kind of wants to focus on CGC 9.6s, I don't think that's like a dead hobby or way of collecting. The reason for that is, when you think about it, CGC 9.8 books and the difference between 9.6s and 9.8s are really minuscule. Sometimes you can't, if you have a 9.6 and a 9.8 beside each other, you can't even really tell the difference. So, and considering for some issues, a 9.6 could be half the price of a CGC 9.8. So I think, if your budget permits and you're a bit budget constricted, I think that's actually a really good idea to, just buy 9.6s instead of 9.8s if you're budget constricted, because you're still getting a really near mint book, and basically a book that most of them almost look like a 9.8. Same first appearances, same book, in a really high grade, but in some cases it's half the price of a CGC 9.8. So I totally get that way of thinking, and I don't think if you've chosen to kind of focus on buying CGC 9.6s, mostly probably because of a budget constraint, I would say, I think that's actually a good call, because first of all, 9.6s are better than 9.4s and 9.2s, and for that same reason, you're still getting a really high grade book. And a lot of times it is hard to justify, spending hundreds and hundreds of more dollars in some cases on a CGC 9.8 than a 9.6. So I completely understand that. But, just to kind of give you guys some reasons for my side of things being on the CGC 9.8 side and sticking to CGC 9.8 comics, I did kind of boil it down to three reasons of why I chose to focus on CGC 9.8. And the first reason, it's I have a blurb here from an Overstreet price guide from 3 years ago. It's a 2015 one, and I'm just going to read it really quick here. It's from Dan Gallo, who's a comic art dealer, and he goes to cons. Apparently, he goes to a lot of cons to sell books. So what he says here, he's comparing Amazing Spider-Man 252 and Amazing Spider-Man 300, and one of the lines here, I'll just read it. With modern books, I would shoot for the 9.8s because they're just too common, and I think over time we will see a widening of the gap between 9.8s and 9.6s. There are few exceptions. The few exceptions would be Amazing Spider-Man 300, Batman Adventures number 12, and maybe New Mutants 98, he says. Obviously those books being kind of the three most expensive CGC 9.8s in kind of the superhero universe. He does go on in his blurb here to do a similar analysis that I've been doing, where I take the number of 9.8s and I divide it by the total number of graded copies for that book, and then you get that 9.8 ratio I talk a lot about. And he gets into that with Amazing Spider-Man 252 and Amazing Spider-Man 300, and sort of goes on to explain why Amazing Spider-Man 300 is so much more expensive. And basically it's because of that 9.8 ratio. Again, for Amazing Spider-Man 300, only 6% of all graded copies are 9.8s, Whereas, most books are over 10%, most books are like over 20% even. So to have a book where only 6% of all copies are 9.8s is super rare. So that's why essentially you get a really iconic first appearance like Venom, plus being super rare on the CGC Census is going to get you Amazing Spider-Man 300, which is why it's $2,000 in the CGC 9.8. So that is basically the first reason that got me thinking about investing in CGC 9.8s. There's a couple other advisors, because I really like to read these Overstreet manuals. Before the price guide, there's about 50 pages where their advisors do blurbs for the year, and they talk about the comic market of the prior year. So you get a lot of similar sentiment from other dealers as well, saying that for modern books, you probably want to stick with the CGC 9.8, especially if you're thinking about it from an investment perspective. And he also goes on to talk about that too, like how his collection style is more investor friendly rather than just a type of collector, which is why I think he has that focus on CGC 9.8s for modern books. So that is the first reason. Is I read a lot and I did some research, and you hear a lot of experts essentially in the field saying that for 80s and 90s books you want to stick with the 9.8s if you're an investor. So that's my first reason. Second reason is limited numbers. So it's really great to look on the CGC Census for a book you might have bought and see that it's a 1 of 200 or 1 of 300 or a 1 of 400 book. Amazing Spider-Man 300, one of the most popular issues ever. First Venom, there's about 950 of those in the CGC 9.8. So, obviously for such popular first appearances, there's going to be more numbers for certain books. But to have that tangible reason is something you want, because if you just buy a raw copy of a book, there's really no way you could ever have a tangible fact saying that this book is rare or not. Whereas if you stick with graded books, you can look on the CGC Census, and with 80s and 90s books, looking on the CGC Census for CGC 9.8s. Yeah, in general, if it's a first appearance, you're getting over in the 80s and 90s, you're getting to that 1,000 copy level, and a lot of times over. Like I know for First Carnage, Amazing Spider-Man 361, there's almost 3,000 of those in the CGC 9.8. Whereas Amazing Spider-Man 300 and a lot of books in the 80s, there's usually less than 1,000. Like most key issues in Spider-Man have about 6, 7, 800. Amazing Spider-Man 252, Amazing Spider-Man 298, 316, that Venom cover. All those usually a little bit under 1,000. But it's just good to know. It's I kind of relate it to investing in the stock market. When you want to invest in a company, you go, okay, for the last 5 years they've been growing 20%, and their earnings per share has grown 20% for the last 5 years, and you can look at their business model and see if they have any kind of competitive advantages when it comes to pricing and stuff like that. So those are kind of like tangible reasons of why you would want to invest in a stock, like, oh, it's grown 30% over the last 5 years. So with comics, it's kind of hard to have that tangible reason besides the first appearance. But with a CGC 9.8 book, you can say, I own this book because it's the first appearance of Venom, and in the CGC 9.8, this is a 1 of 900 copy. So, that's just another fact that shows that it's a limited quantity item. And I think that's really important when you're investing in comic books, because like I've said before in certain videos, comic books don't produce anything. They're not really classic investments. Whereas, if you invest in a stock of a company, that company's making money every day. It's spinning off cash. It's making profits. And a lot of times it's giving you dividends in return. So there's that tangible cash kind of spin-off when you're investing in a company or a stock. Whereas a comic book, it just sits there and looks pretty, and it's not making profits, or there's not anything happening. So when you can't point to that, you want other tangible reasons to own a comic book. And I think looking on the CGC Census and seeing that some of these 9.8s are 1 of 200, 1 of 100, 1 of 300, whatever the book might be. I think that's really important when you're thinking about investing in comics. Especially, and this kind of leads into our third reason, there were so many comic books printed in the 80s and 90s. So especially as the Overstreet Advisor said, which I read in my first reason, for modern comics, I think you pretty much want to stick with CGC 9.8s. And by modern comics, I mean pretty much 1980s and on. Some comics in the 70s too. Like I got a Star Wars 1 from 1977 in a CGC 9.8. So you can pick away in the 70s, but they start getting expensive for some books eventually. So many issues printed in the 80s and 90s. I think it makes a lot of sense to stick with the CGC 9.8s for 80s and 90s books. And if you do watch this channel, I've pretty much completely focused on 80s and 90s books and some from the 70s, but I don't really buy Silver Age books or Golden Age books. And yeah, for me, I just, I buy what I love, like 100% buy what I love. So I don't really have too much of a connection with Silver Age books because I was born in 1985. So, all those books growing up and my, being 10 years old and collecting and looking back and seeing Amazing Spider-Man 300 and all those 80s books that I was really nostalgic for, that's what I really wanted to collect. And I think if you're in that boat where you do like 80s and 90s books the most and that's what you're collecting, and if you're thinking about it from an investment perspective, I think sticking with the CGC 9.8s for that generation is pretty important. Again, only if you're thinking about it from an investment perspective, because I think, I've said this before, buying comic books is in a 9.4 or 9.2 is better than buying no comic books. But if you did, again, if you were coming at it from an investment perspective, maybe you were selling some of your investment portfolio to buy stocks or to buy comic books, which is kind of what I did initially. What I started, I kind of earmarked, a little over $10,000 at first to just kind of buy a lot of these 80s comics that I really loved. So if you're doing that, I would recommend to stick to the CGC 9.8s. Now another thing too, which is kind of a part of the third reason, and the third reason being they're so well printed in the 80s and 90s, is that collecting kind of became a thing. In, I would say, the early 90s, it really became a thing. And by that I mean it was like the hottest thing a 10-year-old kid could do in the early 90s was to collect comics and sport cards, I would say. And during that time is sort of the peak of the comic printing bubble, I would say. So yeah, a lot of those early 90s books like a New Mutants 98 or an Amazing Spider-Man 361 First Carnage, all those in the CGC 9.8 have 2,900 copies or even more. So at that point you're not looking very rare at all, and you can even imagine how much less rare it gets if you start buying 9.6s and 9.4s and 9.2s. At that point you have like a 1 in 10,000 item, so it's not really limited at that point. Okay, so just kind of going over the three reasons really quickly. So my first reason was basically getting advice from the Overstreet price guide, and as I said, I kind of who is it? Dan Gallo, who's a comic book dealer, and he goes to Comic Cons and sells books. Again, he said, with modern age books, I would shoot for the 9.8s because they are just too common, and I think over time we will see a widening of the gap between the 9.8s and the 9.6s. But, that being said, you can't kind of believe everything you read in this Overstreet book. Just as I was kind of trying to find this quote, I saw someone say that New Mutants 98, he was like, I could see it being worth just as much as Amazing Spider-Man 300 in the CGC 9.8. And yeah, he's like, eventually it's going to be $1,500 to $2,000. That didn't happen. New Mutants 98 kind of went the other way, and he didn't reference the CGC Census at all, and you can tell, he was just kind of saying that on basically hopes and dreams, or maybe he was a big Deadpool fan, because yeah, if you look at the CGC Census for New Mutants 98 and Amazing Spider-Man 300, it's a really good comparison of why, you know, New Mutants 98 is only like $600 to $650 now, and Amazing Spider-Man 300 is $2,000. And it's just, you know, that early 90s New Mutants book is, there's like I said, there's 2,900 in the CGC 9.8, and, you know, tens of thousands graded by CGC as well, because that was at the peak of the comic book printing. And even Amazing Spider-Man 300 in 1988, you know, collecting didn't quite become the coolest thing in the world at that time in the late 80s. It kind of took a few more years. And books were well printed in the 80s, don't get me wrong, but it just didn't reach that level of the early 90s, where, again, I think it was almost like a blow-off top bubble of comic printing. So, yeah, personally, I don't think New Mutants 98 will ever get near Amazing Spider-Man 300, and it's literally because of the numbers on the CGC Census. Like, I think Deadpool and Venom are kind of equally as cool as first appearances, and they'd probably be equally as priced if there were less copies of New Mutants 98 on the CGC Census, and if that CGC ratio was below 10%, which it's not. For New Mutants 98, it's 20%, whereas Amazing Spider-Man 300, it's 6%. And that's basically the reason why Amazing Spider-Man is 2,000 and New Mutants 98 is 600. Because, yeah, I totally agree that they're about the same iconic type first appearances. So, yeah, the Overstreet advisors are, you know, their advice seems to be to go with the 9.8s instead of the 9.6s if you're thinking about it from an investment perspective. Second reason, limited numbers, so you're getting a 1 of 200, 1 of 300 item, and that's really important just to have that, you know, those tangible facts behind why you own a book. And yeah, again, third reason, so many issues printed in the 80s and 90s, and collecting became a thing in the early 90s, so that even makes more, you know, high-grade copies available because, you know, people took a lot better care of them, and there were so many. So it kind of compounds in the early 90s. So definitely, if you are out there and looking to focus on 80s and 90s books, and like I said, you're thinking about it from an investment perspective, maybe you did sell some of your investment portfolio to buy comics, I would, in that scenario, I would stick with CGC 9.8 comics only. And, you know, be patient. You know, there's certainly a lot of buy it nows at inflated prices for CGC 9.8 comics. So, you know, whatever book you might be, just be patient and wait for those kind of 1 week auctions where, you know, on eBay they throw them up for a week and there's bids, and because that's where you're usually in general going to get the best prices rather than a buy it now. Almost all the time those are priced about 100 or, you know, 10 or 20%, I would say, over a fair 1 week auction price. So yeah, stick with the 9.8s, you know, be patient and look for those auctions, especially if you're buying 80s and 90s books. For sort of 1975 and before, you know, this video doesn't really apply because CGC 9.8s before then are just so rare, sometimes they don't even exist, and they're so expensive. So they're just pretty much out of everyone's price range. I would recommend for, you know, Silver Age and Golden Age collectors, just, you know, go buy all those first appearances and origins in the best raw grades that you can afford. And I think that's a really good way to go about investing in comics, and I've said this before, that's probably the best way to invest in comics, would be buying, you know, those issues from the 60s and the 50s with all those iconic first appearances in the best grade you can afford. But for me, because, you know, I don't really have any nostalgic connections to those issues, I've chosen to kind of stick to the 80s and 90s. And in that scenario, I think you do want to stick with the CGC 9.8s, and that's what I'd recommend. For most of my reading, that's what I think most people would recommend too, especially if you're kind of bringing another level to your collecting, maybe even thinking about it as, you know, investing. Okay, so yeah, I don't think CGC 9.6 guy is dead either. I think that definitely makes sense if it sort of matches your budget and like your scenario in life. Because I do actually think on paper that's a really good idea. Like, you're pretty much getting the exact same comic, but it's like almost half the price in a 9.6 instead of a 9.8. Like, if you don't care about, investing or having your comic book go up in price, or if you're not really thinking about it from an investment perspective, man, yeah, I think actually buying CGC 9.6s instead of 9.8s is actually a pretty good strategy. So it's going to depend on what you want to do, you know, like, and that's, you know, for me, sometimes I'll get some criticism about my collecting methods, but it's just, you know, I just like to stick to 80s and 90s books and modern books, just because I have no nostalgic connection to 60s or 70s books. I don't remember the covers from when I was young, so I don't care. And, you know, that's my style. Again, I think if you're being pretty strategic, and you're not really worried about nostalgia or anything like that, like the best way to invest in books is to buy those Silver Age and Golden Age first appearances in the best grade you can find. Because back then, you know, the books weren't as well printed, so a little more rare, and I mean, those are all those classic first appearances of characters that are just going to be around forever. So, and there's so many. So, yeah, I would actually recommend to, you know, if you were just purely investing in comics, to probably do that. But for me, with that nostalgic connection to the 1980s and the 90s, I like to stick with the CGC 9.8 books, and I would recommend that to stick with CGC 9.8 books too, if it matched your budget and if you were thinking about it from an investment perspective. Okay, that's going to be it for this video today. I didn't really want to bring out any issues and like analyze them like I normally do. I just kind of wanted to, you know, lay out some of the reasons why I chose to stick to 9.8 books. Because yeah, I think it can be a little bit confusing if you don't kind of get some context and some reasons behind why I've chose to go the CGC 9.8 route. But thanks so much for watching. If you haven't already, please join the team and subscribe to Team CGC here, and hit that bell notification, get all the notifications for our latest videos. Yeah, doing about 5 videos a week at this point, and we're just 2 months into the channel, so if you could subscribe to the channel at this early stage, you know, we need all the subscribers we can at this early stage to kind of get us to 1,000 as quick as we can, is sort of my short-term goal probably for this year. And, you know, being 2 months into the channel, I think we got a pretty good start. So subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you on the next video.